It's Thursday, February 1st, and this is the 1909, the State News' weekly podcast featuring our reporters talking about the news. I'm your host, Alex Walters. This week, I'm joined by State News Administration reporter Theo Scheer. First, Theo's going to walk us through some common misconceptions about what can and can't be reported to MSU's Title IX office. Then, he's going to talk to us about his revelatory reporting on the after-action review of MSU's response to the February campus shooting. With that, let's start the show. All right. Joining me now is the incredible Theo Scheer. Theo,
thank you.
Welcome back. Good to have you back on the show.
It's really good to be back.
Yeah, you're a frequent guest. You've been on.
I am. I mean,
you're pretty, I think half of them actually.
Well, I just love the 1909.
Yeah,
so.
and you don't get paid to come on because you're not a host. So you're just here out of the goodness of your heart.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of cool. You know, I think the audience might appreciate that. All right, well, Theo, enough joking around. We've got serious news to talk about. We've done a lot of reporting here on the State News about what goes on in MSU's Office of Institutional Equity, colloquially known as the Title IX office. But as you've reported pretty extensively on, Title IX is not all they're doing. No, but anyway, we've talked to a lot of people who have gone through that process, survivors of sexual violence, and, you know, the decision to report, I think the survivors that we've talked to most extensively have come to regret that. They have not had great experiences with it, and I think a lot of things were surprising to them. Maybe they didn't have a full expectation of exactly what it was going to look like when they did choose to report, or when they were sort of forced into that process by some sort of mandatory reporting. But anyway, so you did some great stories over the last couple of weeks, just kind of helping people have maybe a little bit more information, being more fully informed about what that decision to report looks like. And so I wanted to have you on. You can talk about it. I think it'll be great. Yeah. So first of all, and I think this is the biggest misconception, is that, you know, we have a very narrow view of what kind of things can be reported to the OIE. I think people tend to think of purely sexual violence, right? That's the only thing to think about. Right. But it's a lot broader than that. Can you talk the listeners of the 1909 through what's everything that can be reported to the OIE?
Yeah, so it's going to be easier to think of it in two categories. Mm-hmm. So first of all, you have this Title IX and RVSM. So that's sexual assault, stalking, sexual violence in general, relationship violence, and just misconduct in that variety. You have that, but then you also have the anti-discrimination policy, or ADP. Mm-hmm. So that would cover, you know, racial discrimination, harassment, different, you know, hate speech. But it's a little bit tricky because with all of these things, you know, there are instances where you might report speech that you perceive as hateful. However, MSU won't end up agreeing with you. You know, they'll say this doesn't violate our policies for harassment. And it just depends on whether it sort of reaches this level of, you know, unwelcome conduct that's, you know, objectively severe, persistent, and pervasive. And MSU is the one who decides that. So generally it goes through those tunnels, but there are exceptions. Yeah.
And so let's say, you know, someone has experienced conduct that they feel victimized by. They want to report it to the OIE. How do you do that?
Yeah, so no matter whether it's under, again, this Title IX, RVSM, or ADP, you can always report it through the Public Incident Reporting Form, I believe it's called. This is all online on their website. And it's just this whole, this form that, fill out, just basically describe on your own your experiences, and then MSU, again, decides what category it falls into, and the process kind of goes from there.
Yeah, and so, you know, process going from there. Talk me through you report, right? You've said this is the conduct that I experienced. What's the next thing that happens? What are they going to do?
Yeah, so MSU's Office of Institutional Equity, OIE, they receive the report. They have an investigator basically look at it and then reach out again to the person who filed it. That person is called the claimant, right? And, you know, they ask for more details sometimes. They ask for a little bit of clarification. But the really important thing is that they offer these supportive measures to the claimant. Like, for example, if you have a class of somebody who you've had faced harassment with or something, and you don't want to see them, they can sort of coordinate, like, moving classes. They can coordinate schedule changes. They can put in no contact directives with them.
So, like, during the time of the investigation, they can enact some manner of sanctions to these things even before there's a finding.
Exactly, and this is all. This is before they make any sort of official decision in regards to those things. So the process really starts off with that. At that point, it's up to the claimant to decide whether they want to move forward and go kind of this official route, whether to pursue an investigation into the claims of misconduct, to go through this whole process of having a hearing and then a final decision to see whether they violated MSU's policies officially. And so that is a whole nother process. So if
so talk us through, before we get through to kind of results, that when you talk about an investigation, the investigatory process the OIE goes through if you report harassment or discrimination or anything like that, is it, parties are submitting evidence, there's interviews, talk us through, what do you have to do during this process?
Yeah. So the report is going to be referred to an investigator if they decide to go through with it. Then there's more of these interviews. The investigator reaches out to the claimant and they piece together what happens in full. Then the investigator uses information to compile this big report. A formal complaint is what it's called. Once they have that, the claimant reviews and signs the complaint, and I know this is getting kind of bogged down in all of these details, but now the investigation officially begins. Now that they have this signed formal complaint. More interviews, basically, not only with the claimant, but also the rest of the people that involves, the respondent, the witnesses,
the accused, and they use claimant, respondent, sort of legal terminology. I think in more common terms, be kind of accused, accuser.
Right. Where the respondent is the person being accused. Yeah, exactly. They have all of these interviews, and then they have a hearing. So. Basically, they have this sort of cross-examination, where official, third-party investigators kind of question each individual that's involved in it. They have this. I think I'm blanking on the term, but a credibility.
They'll do a credibility assessment. It's something that we've reported on, where they kind of, a lot of these cases are things that people perceived, things that happened between two people in rooms people weren't in, other people weren't in, and so they do this kind of assessment of who's credible and who's not. And we've talked to survivors who've gone through that process and felt victimized by it. Talked to an expert on the kind of psychology who felt like it was rather unscientific, but that's the process that they use.
Right, that is.
But anyway, Theo, so this whole thing, this process of reporting to, the talking about sanctions, to signing the formal complaint, to the exchange of evidence during the investigatory period, to the hearing, all of this. Can you talk me through how long all of that takes?
Right. So, officially, it provides 90 days to complete the investigation, 60 days for that hearing process, then 38 days to resolve the whole, if somebody decides to appeal, it's 38 days for that. But in total, realistically, we can expect almost about a year of all of this investigation. And, you've talked to survivors, and people have told the state news that that can be kind of triggering to have that prolonged.
Because you're making me do math here, Theo, which is tricky, but 90, 60, was it 10 at the end?
90, 60, 38.
38, that's 180, right? But we know from the actual data that on average it takes 361 days. So they're allowed to extend that period?
Yeah, well, they are, yes. They are allowed to extend it. And part of that, and you reported on this a little bit ago, is that they're kind of understaffed. They have some problems with that, so it takes much longer than what they allow officially. But they can extend everything.
We did some, like you said, we did some reporting over the summer and got a hold of some of these. They had hired outside consultants to kind of diagnose, why are these cases taking a year to complete? And they had, just the biggest finding was just understaffing, that the university wasn't hiring enough people to operate this office in a way where cases could go for shorter than a year. And like you said, a lot of the survivors that we've talked to at the state news say that year-long timeline, having to relive these experiences over and over again, can kind of be re-traumatizing, can almost re-victimize them.
Exactly.
Constantly
reminded of these things.
But thank you. It's these stories that Theo's put together. He's put together a couple online explainers that you'll be able to find on statenews.com. Kind of talking through this is a great service for people to know exactly what they're getting into when they're making a decision whether or not to report conduct they experience. So thank you for doing that. Speaking of great reporting done by Theo Scheer, we've got another story to talk about. Theo, let me flip over my notes. Get into it, 2 topics.
Right.
1 man. He's impressive. Okay. You've been doing a lot of reporting on this after-action review of the Michigan State University, the shooting that occurred last February 13th, which we talked about a lot in the 1909. And, in the wake of that shooting, a lot of questions were raised about the police response. Why did it take so long to take the shooter? Why were there these delays in response time from MSU PD? And so, in the spring, the university decided they were going to have an outside firm come in and review it and do some sort of investigation of exactly how it went, why it went the way it did, and then make some recommendations. And, you have been following since that began and then through to the release of it this very closely. Can you tell me a little bit about, a couple months ago we got the report, the result of that outside investigation. Just before we get into all the things you found about the process, just tell us what was in the report. What did it say?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the interesting thing. Like you said, there were a lot of questions after the shooting. I mean, for example, the 13-minute gap between when the gunman fired and when the emergency alert was set out, or, the fact that Berkey Hall didn't have lockable doors, all of these things. And I think people were sort of looking towards the after-action review to critique, really analyze those what went wrong.
Yeah.
The thing is, it didn't. It didn't address either of those major things and a lot of the other aspects of the shooting that have been heavily, scrutinized.
Yeah.
And Bridge, Michigan did a great article on this. They showed through some public documents that MSU didn't specifically ask firms to analyze what went wrong. It was only what could be improved. And you can kind of see that in this report. It was 26 pages, which is a lot shorter than a lot of other reports of this nature. And it just didn't really go too in-depth into, officer responses. I mean, it called for a little bit more communication, coordination, more officers in MSU DPPS, but not much more than that.
So instead of asking the firms to sort of answer some of the questions people had about, what went wrong that night of the shooting, instead the firms are asked just to provide feedback for, in future emergencies, what would be done differently. I see. And so then, we get this report. You write a great story about it. A lot of people write stories about the differences between sort of the questions that had been raised and what was answered. But then in October, we heard something that sort of, I think, sparked a lot of curiosity for us. Do you want to tell us?
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about this on 1909 before. A trustee, Brianna Scott, sent a letter to the board calling for the board chair's removal, just for a number of reasons.
There's a long list of reasons, but one of them is with the review.
Yeah, one of them has to do with the review. She's claimed that the board chair, Rima Vassar, told investigators for this review to change a wording. Originally, apparently, there was this wording that was really kind of tough on the trustees. They said that it was chaotic. They went beyond their role as trustees.
Which is a sensitive thing for the MSU board.
Exactly.
We just had a president resign saying that they were interfering and overstepping. So
there's a long history of that sort of, and apparently, according to Scott's letter, Vassar had that changed, softened, and into this thing that we see in the current after-action review. And so I was curious about that.
We should say, though, the October board meeting, Vassar then, she denied that allegation, saying that it was another trustee who asked for it to be changed, but that she supported that. She just was the first one
that it wasn't
ask.
her.
Yeah. But anyway, so that I think in here raised a lot of questions because we were like, we had this review, and now it's being said that parts of this review could be changed if they upset leaders at MSU who didn't like the way that things were done. And so we started clamoring for okay, well, what else was changed? What else was different in the first version than the last version? And you started doing some reporting, just going right to the firm. Do you want to talk us through?
Yeah, I figured
you
that
had a
would
lot
be
of communication with the firm.
The most direct route. So I called the firm. They said that they really weren't able to tell me anything. In fact, they told me that they had an NDA with the university preventing them from saying anything to the press. And then I was like, all right, that makes sense. I called MSU, a spokesperson, who told me that there is actually no NDA and that maybe they don't want to talk to the press, but an actual NDA doesn't exist. So I went back to them and I kind of asked for a little bit of clarification on that. And they said, they gave me kind of it was kind of a hard to decipher answer. They basically said, that's just the impression that we're under. You can interpret that however you'd like, but we really can't comment on these findings.
It's interesting. I guess, I'm not an NDA expert, but I guess an NDA could be enforceable even if one party is denying its existence. In fact, maybe part of the NDA is the NDA itself. That's kind of meta, but that could be the structure. But so you got back in the firm. They denied you. They actually didn't. I remember being here that day when you did that. They blocked your phone too.
Yeah.
We had to call them from my phone.
Yeah. It was interesting. So I don't know. That sort of set off a few things. I was just wondering, how can I, see what else they might have changed in this review. So Yeah, basically we filed a public records request.
We did, and we got lucky.
We got
because,
lucky, yeah.
Sort of, in a way. Because, normally, for the 1909 listeners who aren't familiar with the intricacies of the Michigan Freedom of Information Act, I don't know why you would be. It's so boring. But anyway, because this makes great podcast talking about it.
Oh, yeah, they love it.
But anyway, the listeners love that. But no, you can't get drafts made within a public body because they say that, like, a place like MSU, even though it's subject to record requests, taxpayer dollars, they want public officials to be able to have sort of frank communication. And so stuff like a first draft is hidden from records requests. But this was not a draft within a public body. It was a draft from an outside party, this third-party firm, to a public body.
Right.
So we were able to get around that, and you were able to get your hands on this much talked about first draft of the shooting review.
Well, it wasn't easy. I mean, the FOIA office, they denied the request at first.
They did, yeah.
But then we appealed. We got it eventually.
We got in there.
Yeah.
Anyway, you got this first draft, and there were a couple big things in it that you wrote about. First, just tell me, you kind of got to close the loop on this allegation about the trustee thing. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Basically, I confirmed that originally the draft had reported, and let me pull up the exact wording here, because it is interesting. Initially, it reported that the Board of Trustees members desperately wanted to help and became involved in the incident beyond their expertise and outside of their appropriate role. So it's this really kind of accusatory, finding.
And what was the final version? If you can read that to us too?
Yeah. So it softened the wording. It said that trustees wanted to help, but became involved in the incident beyond the customary role and expectations of a governance board during an emergency.
Yeah. So it's a lot harsher, that first finding.
Exactly, yeah. So that does confirm, part of what was being talked about between the trustees. That, yes, it was changed. I mean, the details of how there are disagreements on between board members. But yeah, I mean, so I just, I spent a little bit comparing the two documents and seeing what else was different.
Well, and you found something that was not present really whatsoever in the final version, which is kind of the focus of your story. And tell us about that.
Yeah. So I found that originally the draft reported that agencies and officers that responded to the shooting refused to comply in the investigation, in the after action review. As a whole, they didn't want to talk about or review what went on, and in fact said, we should also note. This is
the language from the first draft.
Yes, this is the first draft.
Go on.
We should also note that some law enforcement officers, including federal agencies, refused to participate in the review. This decision and lack of trust is unfortunate, and this, kind of sparked something in me. I mean, what does lack of trust mean? And I tried to figure out exactly who might have not participated. I mean, I talked to Marlon Lynch. He's the MSU DPPS vice president, I believe, and chief of police. He said that MSU did comply with everything. He wasn't able to confirm. Again, all this stuff is done in secrecy, right? They don't have the names of the people they interviewed public. So Marlon Lynch wasn't able to confirm that every officer that was asked to be interviewed agreed to be interviewed. He did say that the final review, made a point to acknowledge MSU's cooperation in the review.
The second version.
Yeah. Oh, well, actually, both versions said that. So he's using that as proof of their compliance.
Yeah. And what about other? Because you reached out to so many agencies for this story. What about other agencies? What did they tell you?
It's it's interesting. The only agency was the FBI, and they said that that they would not comment basically on this. That they supported their law enforcement officer on the scene, but they wouldn't comment on that specific allegation. But every other local agency, I contacted about a dozen now, East Lansing Police Department, Lansing, Meridian Township, Ingham County, State Police, etc. They all said that they weren't contacted for the review at all. The investigators didn't even reach out to them.
Really?
Yeah, so it kind of raises even more questions now about the extent of this review as a whole. I mean, they're saying that people, refused to participate, but who exactly was that? I mean, the only person who, again, declined to comment on this was the FBI.
And the other federal agencies, what did they say?
Right. There were 4 federal agencies. FBI was one of them. The other 3, they all said that they weren't contacted either.
Really? So the firm's saying, none of the agencies complied. That's so disappointing.
Right.
The agencies are saying the firm never asked us.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, well, FBI aside.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, Theo, You've done so much great work on this. They don't want to tell you anything. You're going up against them, getting the facts. I'm sure you're going to keep doing it. Answer some more of these questions for us. Thank you so much for coming on the show, for doing all this great work.
Thank you so much, Alex. Appreciate being on here.
That's all for now, but we'll be back next week with fresh reporting from the great minds here at the State News. Until then, the stories we discussed and plenty more are available at statenews.com. Thank you to our incredible podcast editor, Anthony Brinson, my guest, Theo, and most of all, thank you for listening. For the 1909, I'm Alex Walters.